Hello, everybody, and welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A podcast which examines very fascinating people, the topics that they care about, and most importantly, what their ideal world would be. If you like what you see here, please like, share, and subscribe. John Strafford is the founder and head of the Campaign for Conservative Democracy group, of which was founded in 1994. The group seeks to have a more democratic Conservative Party, both in terms of constitutional and governmental matters. He has contributed to the Bow Group think tank and Conservative Home, as well as having made countless other media appearances throughout the years. Thank you for coming on once again.
You're welcome.
Okay. And the first question I wanted to ask you is actually about the Conservative Party as it currently stands at the moment, if I may. Is that what do you make of the current state of the Tories at the moment, and who, if anyone, in the potential leadership election could get the party back on track, do you think?
First of all, the Tory party at the moment is heading to oblivion at the 2024 general election. And it's got itself into such a state that it is a complete and total mess. And the only way it can avoid oblivion is by radical reform of the Conservative Party. And if it adopts radical reform, which involves bringing the members back into play, then it has a chance to mitigate the catastrophe of the 2024 election and also set the scene for a revival of the party. Without that radical reform, I'm afraid the party's finished. Who in the current contenders do I think I would support? Actually, I support none of the three big names that have been mentioned so far, i.e. Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and Mordaunt, because I don't agree with any of them, because I don't think that any of them are actually genuine, real conservatives.
Mm-hmm. I do find it interesting in the case of Boris. Why do you think there are still many people, especially on Twitter, it seems, many of sort of like the diehard sort of Tory fanboys, if you don't mind me saying, who still support Boris Johnson, even though they presumably are the same ones who would criticize him in many other ways? Why do you think there's still such a support for Johnson, even though, as I think you say rightly, he's clearly not very conservative in many ways?
Well, he is a superb campaigner, and he brought off a brilliant general election victory. But unfortunately, as a administrator, as a governance, he's hopeless. And this is what we discovered during the course of his tenure as prime minister, and that he basically Boris is only concerned with Boris, and he says yes to every person that he talks to. But during the course of the prime ministership, we discovered that actually that meant that if he had to lie to somebody, he lied to them, and it was complete catastrophe. I have no doubt whatsoever that he is the worst prime minister of my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that his administration, just beyond what you said, was such a disaster? Do you think one reason, and maybe I'm just speculating here because I've recently read a very good book by Michael Ashcroft called First Lady about a certain Miss Simmons. Do you think that might have had to play into it, the fact that he hadn't perhaps the wrong people advising him to some extent, or is it just the fact that he's just not, he's more interested in his career as opposed to the country?
I don't think Boris really bothers who advises him because he just goes whichever way the wind blows, and that was his problem. So even if he had a good team of advisors, he would just ignore them, and some of his policies were absolutely disgraceful. His pursuit of net zero without costing the costs of doing that, it was just irresponsible and has had a major impact on politics. But I'm afraid Boris is just the last one of something that's been happening in the Tory party now for the last 20 years. And it started with the new constitution in 1998, where Centre Office took total control of the party and centralised everything. And then Cameron came in, manipulated the candidates list, agreed with Ed Miliband on net zero and Gordon Brown on working tax credits. These were not conservative policies at all. But because Cameron had manipulated the list, he started bringing in as candidates Lib Dem wokey people. And the result was that the party's been swamped by these Lib Dem wokey people. And now it would appear that they've almost got a majority. And that is why there is such a huge gap between the parliamentary party and the voluntary party.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I find that very interesting, especially because if you look at his A list, which I think was what you were referring to earlier, it is very interesting how, if anyone wants to know why a lot of the Conservative Party establishment is so swamped with progressive ideologues, that list could give you a whole, clue as to what. And even as recently as like a couple of months ago during the other leadership election of this year, he noted that in the times that essentially he increased the Conservative Party's diversity through this stuff, which is a good thing, even though it doesn't seem to have helped matters very much beyond beyond the vague. Anyway, in the next question I want to ask you is that in a recent Today interview,
just come back to you on the A list
mm,
because I got involved in that because in 2006, after Cameron became leader, I was asked by the party board to look at the A list and to see what effect it was having on the constituency associations because they were getting very uptight about having candidates imposed on them. And so I and a couple of other people looked at the whole A list situation. And we discovered, surprise, surprise, that actually women were being selected in proportion to the numbers that were coming forward. Only a third of the candidates coming forward were women, and they were getting selected in a third of the seats. And so what I said to in a report for the party board was that what needed to happen was to find out the reasons why only a third of women were coming forward and to publicize the opportunities for women and to attack it that way rather than imposing quotas on constituencies. And I saw David Cameron the day after the party board had received my report, and which recommended that the whole A list be dropped. And I saw David Cameron, and he told me that he'd only brought the A list in because of the leadership contest that he was doing, and that he would agree with me that the A list would be dropped, but it would be dropped privately rather than publicly, so that people didn't take it into account when looking at it. And I thought that was the most cynical approach that could be adopted by any party leader.
well, that's David Cameron in a nutshell, I suppose.
Yes, exactly.
And Liz Truss actually herself was on that A list, which might explain a few things. That's all I'll say. Anyway, the next question I wanted to ask you was that in a recent Today interview, you described the recent conference, the one in Birmingham, as the worst one you've ever been to, and described the party as a quote unquote oligarchy of who spout quote unquote froth. Is it seriously that bad? And if so, who is most at fault? You've already hinted at who might be for the current woeful state of affairs the party finds itself in.
Well, if I tell you that in the last 30 years, we have had 24 party chairmen, every one of which tells you that they are increasing membership. And in fact, they have done absolutely zero for membership. The last national membership campaign was in 1988, which was called the Bulldog campaign, under the then chairman of Peter Brook. Since then, all these party chairmen have been absolutely useless, on average being in office for 1 year and a quarter. And frankly, all they're interested in is once they become party chairman, is what job they're going to get when they cease to be party chairman. So they do nothing to help the membership at all. Coming to the conference, when I first attended the Conservative Party conference in 1964, the party had 2 million members. We had 250,000 young conservatives. The conference was full of 5,000 members. In fact, there's such a demand for members to attend that constituencies were restricted to 8 per constituency. And today, we have got a situation where the members' participation in the conference is zero. In 1964, we had motions for debate. Every constituency was encouraged to submit motions. on policy issues. The constituencies debated the issues. They submitted their motions to central office. Central office then published all the motions in a handbook so that people could see the views of members throughout the country. When we had the debates, they were serious debates, often with policies being announced, and the minister would make a speech of 20 minutes to half an hour. There would then be contributions from the members, and the minister would then, at the end, have to sum up and respond to any questions that he'd been asked during the course of the debate. And the conference went from 10 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon with an hour and a half break at lunch. This last conference, we had 2-hour sessions each day from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. That was it. There were no questions and answer sessions. There were no contributions from the members. We had a succession of ministers giving 10-minute speeches, which were just full of froth. So to make matters worse, the fringe meetings have been completely taken over by the sponsors and the big donors, so that you don't get a genuine debate even at the fringe meetings now. And I understand that one of the reasons why they cut the main sessions short was because the sponsors were complaining that when members were in the main sessions, they weren't attending their fringe meetings. And because they pay huge sums of money to have their fringe meetings. And that is such a horrific contrast with today's Tory party, which has total, utter contempt for the party member compared to what it was in 1964. What a tragedy. Mm. But a party without members is no longer a party. A party without members has become an oligarchy dictating the issues to the party. And of course, clinging on for power, so they can make a lot of money afterwards when they cease to be MPs.
Mm. I was at that conference as well, funnily enough, and yeah, there was sort of like a certain vibe of something wrong in the air. I agree. And one thing I'd say on that quickly before I move on to the next question is that at that conference, I do find it interesting that actual Conservative events, most especially stuff like the New Culture Forum and so on, were outside of the main building, but the Tony Blair Institution was there, which tells you what you need to know on that front, I think.
Exactly. And going back, 1964, there were very few fringe meetings. In fact, there was just basically one fringe meeting per evening. And you had the Bow Group had a fringe meeting, the Monday Club had a fringe meeting, the Young Conservatives had a ball, and then there was the main conference ball, and then the CPC used to have a very serious hour-long lecture. And those were the fringe meetings in 64. And it was much better, much healthier then than having dozens, hundreds of fringe meetings at this conference, which were just spouting off what the sponsors wanted them to.
Yeah, and now more onto your group, actually, because that's one of the reasons I got you on. You started the Campaign for Conservative Democracy in 1994, followed by a 1995 Bow Group paper entitled The Conservative Party for the 21st Century, arguing for a more democratic Conservative Party in terms of the inner functions of it. What made you decide to start the group?
Well, what happened was at that time, I was on the National CPC Committee, and in 1994, and we were invited to 10 Downing Street by John Major. And John Major said he was having huge difficulty with the party, and particular MPs over Maastricht and Europe, and there was nothing he could do about it. And so I pointed out to him that the reason for this was because the party didn't have a constitution. Up to that point, the party consisted of 3 elements, which were the Parliamentary Party, the National Union of Conservative Associations, and Conservative Central Office. And all 3 were totally separate units. And I had pointed out in a paper I did in 1990 that what was needed was for these 3 elements to come together. And I proposed a party board, which I got heavily criticised for, but which Sir Norman Fowler took up and he brought in 1993. But the difference between his party board and mine was that mine was a democratically elected party board, and his was pretty well nearly all appointments. And so I said to John Major, your difficulty is you've just got no connection, no constitution, by which you can try and discipline these MPs, because constituencies are totally autonomous. He said, would I do a paper on this? This was the meeting was on a Friday, and on the Monday, 10 Downing Street phoned me up and said, "Where's this paper?" So I took the week off work and I wrote out my proposals for a constitution for the party and sent it off to John Major. And his initial reaction, which I was told about, was euphoric, and he thought it was exactly what was required. He then spoke to the various people in the party who've got big vested interests, like the donors and the women's organisation, he backed off and said that he wrote to me after a couple of weeks and said he was very sorry, but it was too close to this is 1994, too close to a general election for him to do anything. I tried to persuade him to proceed without success, and that's why I then published the paper, got the Vogue Group to publish the paper. And what happened after that was that Archie Norman saw the paper that I'd written and thought it was just what the party needed. So when William Hague became the leader in 1997, Archie Norman, who had set up a working group with myself on it, he then put it to William Hague that this is what we should do. William Hague was also euphoric and made a superb speech in July of 1997 saying how much he was in favor of a Democratic Party. Unfortunately, he then took a year to bring this Democratic Party into fruition with the Constitution. And during that year, every vested interest in the world put their poke in. And instead of being a Democratic Party, we ended up with the most centralized party that you can imagine. And I have to say, in retrospect, it was the biggest mistake of my life to believe that politicians would actually ever do anything which would reduce their own powers. And so that was the disaster. And since that constitution came in, the whole party's been on a downward slope.
Funnily enough, the next question I actually wanted to ask you was that in 1998, on this constitution stuff, funny enough, you were granted concessions, allegedly anyway, by the party who granted a party constitution as per to your aims. What were the problems, you've already hinted at them, that you saw of it at that stage, and what further specifically constitutional reforms would you like to see from the Conservative Party in the future?
What happened in 1998 during this whole year in which the Constitution was being discussed was that we were campaigning for an elected party chairman and deputy chairman, treasurer of the officers of the party. And what happened was that the 1922 committee refused to let us have them. So they gave us a sop and said, well, what we'll do, we will give you a say in the leadership election. And initially, that sop was 50%. And Jeffrey Archer made this speech at party conference saying, the members should have 50% of the votes in the leadership election. I made a speech at that 1998 party conference said that was unacceptable, that what we wanted was the full Monty. We wanted 100% of the votes in the leadership election. And so what they did, we got the 100% of the votes, but then they decided to stitch the whole thing up by saying that the MPs would choose just two to put forward to the members. Well, the MPs, the moment you do that, they are looking at their vested interest. They're not looking at the party, what's best for the party or the nation. They're looking as to who is going to give them the most promotion and what they can get out of it. So that distorts that process. And it's even more distorted now because now, even if you're not a UK citizen, if you're a Russian oligarch living in Moscow, you can join the Conservative Party and you get a vote in the leadership election. So we've allowed all these kind of foreigners now to have votes for the leader of the Conservative Party, who then becomes the Prime Minister. It's quite outrageous what has been done. And this is why we need to have radical reforms of the party. And the reforms that are really essential is that the National Convention, which is supposed to be the voluntary party body, is not fit for purpose. It's never stood up for the members at all, and it's purely an establishment body, of which pretty well everybody's never heard of. So that's not fit for purpose. So it should be scrapped. And what we need to have is an annual general meeting of the party to which every party member is invited. And at that annual general meeting, we should elect the party chairman, party treasurer, party deputy chairman, the chairman of the candidates committee, and the chairman of the CPC. These are the critical bodies in the party. And with that, we then get accountability to the membership, and it will make a huge amount of difference. We've also got to have the ability to change the party's constitution, because at the moment it's virtually impossible. And in any case, as the constitution stands at the moment, it's not worth the paper it's written on, because under clause 17 of the constitution, the party board can take any action in the management and administration of the party which they think is in the best interest of the party. So it makes the rest of the constitution absolutely worthless. And they use that clause 17. I mean, Eric Pickles used it in 2017 of the general election to impose just 3 candidates on constituency associations. What a disgrace that was. And even in the last election, when we came in Beaconsfield to choose our candidates, we were given 3 names, and they tried to stitch it all up and choose one particular person. But fortunately, I was aware that this was going on and managed to stop it, and we got a very good MP out of it. But what a contrast from in Beaconsfield from 1982, when we had a by-election and we had 300 applications from candidates. So we had a real choice compared to what was imposed on us in 2019.
Mm-hmm. And on the next thing on that, before I move on, actually, I'm assuming the MP you're referring to is Joy Morrissey, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Who's been an excellent MP. I mean, she's worked incredibly hard. But unfortunately, Beaconsfield is about to become a very marginal seat because yesterday, for example, Beaconsfield was within the top 5 constituencies in the country, strongest constituencies in the country. When I was chairman, we had a membership of 6,500. Today, it's down to 1,000 and diminishing. And at that level, you cease to be capable of running a national or running a campaign in a general election, because you don't have the number of activists on the to man the polling stations and the committee rooms. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we're in this situation. Yesterday, we lost 2 seats in Beaconsfield in the town council elections to the Liberal Democrats. And in addition to which, Dominic Grieve, for the last election as an independent with the Liberal Democrat backing, and they poured 500 people into Beaconsfield during the campaign. So they have established themselves in the constituency. And on top of which, Beaconsfield town is being moved into the Cheshire-Manamersham constituency. So I'm afraid from being one of the top 5 strongest seats in the country, we're now a very marginal seat, and the Lib Dems could well win it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I've actually met Miss Morrissey at the 2021 conference. Actually, she's very polite. So, funnily enough, I was at the same Bow Group meeting at that conference, which I found about your campaign, which is why we're here now. So, even though I do find that interesting, you had enough clout in 1998 that you were able to speak at the main stage, but in 2021 you're sidelined, which says a lot, I think, about the current state of the party.
Well, no members speak from the main stage anymore. None of them. It's not just me. I mean, not a single member can speak from the main stage because they scrapped it.
And yeah, the next question I wanted to ask you is that given how reasonable it seems that a lot of your demands are, and are replicated in other countries, like in the United States, for instance, where it's even as bad as some of their political parties are, at least you have at least, primaries where members can actually get in and do well, or stuff like the Labour Party. I'm sorry.
The United States is wholly undemocratic. The United States doesn't have membership parties. It has registered voters. And that's why they have primaries. And the primaries are considered by registered voters. What they do at a presidential election is set up separate committees to campaign for the president during that election. And they spend billions of dollars in doing that, because they hire out all their helpers or hire in all their helpers. A presidential election can cost $5 billion
Mm.
without blinking. And Stephen Gilbert, who, when he was director of Conservative Central Office, told me in 2006 that that is what the way the Conservative Party wanted to go. In other words, to scrap the membership and go down the United States route. And I then put to him, I said, well, where are you going to get the money from to run the general election campaign? And he didn't have an answer.
Sorry for being a little bit of a nitwit on my end, but hey, you learn something new every day, I suppose. But to reframe it slightly, given that even something like the Labour Party or even smaller parties like UKIP have elected at least an elected, central committee or whatever it is, the Labour and UKIP have elected NECs. Why is it that there's been so much reluctance within the Conservative Party circles, and as you say, invested interests like donors and so on to actually take it forward? Is it because there's too many cynical careerists?
Well, the Conservative Party is dominated by the donors. They pay their 50 grand plus each year, and that gives them a meeting with the Prime Minister, which, they twist his arm and everything else. And because the government, particularly under Boris Johnson, spent so much money, some very nice contracts went their way. And we saw that with the fiasco over PPE during the COVID era, where friends of ministers were getting massive contracts. I mean, some company with £6,000 share capital suddenly gets a contract for 137 million. Well, nobody in private industry would ever dream of doing something like that. So that's the big problem. Big problem in the Conservative Party is the donors have huge influence and huge say on the way it's run. The trouble with the Labour Party is equally bad because they rely wholly on the trade unions to give them their big money. And so this is also trade unions in the Labour Party dominate it. And so it is also undemocratic. So you've got a situation where the two biggest parties in the country are both undemocratic organizations.
Mm. And
That's
especially.
a democracy.
Mm. And one minor question I want to ask before I move on to my next point: has any other major, figures of the Conservative Party ever discussed or even hinted that they're in support of your campaign since the late 90s?
Many, including cabinet ministers. And some of them now we speak at our French meeting of the party conference. I mean, we've had people like Steve Baker, John Hayes, Ben Bradley, Joy Morrissey, Maria Kane. I mean, also spoken at our French meeting of the party conference, and many ministers, cabinet ministers, support what they're doing. What they won't do is generally speak publicly about it because they don't see it as being as enhancing their position in the party because it means going up against the establishment.
Oh, well, anyway.
Privately, most party chairmen, when they cease to be party chairman, come to me and say, I wish we'd listened to you, John, because actually you were right.
Wow.
Party chairman.
How cynical. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to ask you is that on a more downbeat note, I sad to say, how do you feel about recent calls, whether it be from William Hague, as we were discussing earlier, Lord Fickelstein, I think I'm saying that right, and Tobias Elwood, among many other wares, shall we be polite about it, to have the right of the leader, essentially, to have the right to elect the leader taken away from the membership of the party? What do you make of those calls, and especially because they seem to be coming from very well-established figures?
I don't mind the parliamentary party choosing the leader because as I say, we started our campaign by asking for the party chairman and central office to be brought under control. However, if the MPs choose the leader, there's got to be a change in the rules. For example, what they should do is have their ballot on the basis of preferential voting, so that the first candidate to get more than 50% becomes the leader. There should be a limit on how much they can spend on campaigning. I'm told that Liz Truss had £500,000, and in spite of the fact that central office theoretically put a limit of £300,000. These are astronomical sums. And put if you're campaigning and a candidate and you're having to raise that kind of money, it no doubt puts you in the pockets of some of these donors that give it to you. So there need to be some fairly tight rules on the leadership campaign. But in principle, I don't mind if the MPs do elect a leader, as long as the party board consists of democratic people, people elected democratically by the members, and control the party.
Mm-hmm. And on that as well is like, do you worry that, given that not only those calls which I talked about earlier, and the fact that there seems to be no sort of leeway into giving, more democratic means within the Conservative Party, do you worry that some of the establishment in the party want to just turn it into, if you don't mind me being crass about this, a liberal fiefdom, pretty much?
Yes, 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 I do. And it's not so much liberal Democrat fiefdom. They're part of a kind of global movement with the World Economic Forum and some of these big international bodies, the European Union, where accountability of individuals is non-existent. Mm-hmm. And they like that because that means that they can be authoritarian. I mean, look how authoritarian Rishi Sunak was and Boris during the lockdown. Suddenly, you couldn't even go and have a coffee with your neighbour. Mm-hmm. I mean, extraordinary attitude.
Mm-hmm. Except unless you're allowed to, riot in the streets of London or, go and have parties in Downing Street.
Right. Right. If you want to throw paint over some picture or whatever, you get away with it. I mean, these people or stick yourself to the road. These people all get away with it. I mean, I would pick them up and put them in jail for 5 years and say, now you can think about what you've been doing. I mean, the whole thing's become a liberal nightmare.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, because even the French and German police, from what I've seen on on social media and stuff, remove these people away. It's very much anarcho tyranny, if anyone gets that reference. So it's just like that, I suppose. The next thing I wanted to ask you was that you touched on this earlier. In more recent years, you were heavily involved in the successful effort to oust the former Beaconsfield MP Dominic Grieve over his refusal to support Brexit through a vote of no confidence. Yes. Given that this is one of the few areas that Tory members have power, albeit limited, in terms of electoral choice, why do you think it isn't done more often, especially given the clear disconnect, as you've noted earlier, between ordinary members and their supposed representatives?
Because I wasn't successful in getting rid of Dominic Grieve. I can tell you precisely what happened in the process. I got on extremely well with Dominic Grieve, and he was a good MP for 20 years, but then he went off his rocker regarding Europe. And it came to a head, as far as I was concerned, when he said that if we supported Brexit, we'd have 300,000 Chinese immigrants in the country within a year. And I thought, the man's gone mad. So I decided then to start building up a group of people who were supportive of pushing forward a vote of no confidence so that we could deselect him. And I put down a motion for the Beaconsfield annual general meeting of no confidence. And they came back to me, the office in Beaconsfield, and said, "You're not a member of the Conservative Party." And I said, "That's ridiculous." I said, "I've been a member since 1964. No, you're not. You're not on our records as a member." So by the time I got it all sorted out and established that I was a member, the time for putting motions down for the AGM had passed. Then we got to the AGM, and the night before the AGM, I suddenly got an email saying that I was suspended from the party for 3 months, so couldn't attend any meetings. So then I did 3 months and went back and put down a motion for a special general meeting. Incidentally, Dominic Grieve lost the AGM motion by a very sizable majority. And that motion only went forward because the chairman was sympathetic to what I was trying to do, and he knew there'd be an almighty row if he didn't have some motion there. And then we had the special general meeting, and Grieve lost that motion as well, confidence motion. And but he then announced that he was going to ignore these anyway, both these motions. And I wanted to move for, under the party's constitution, a special general meeting has almighty power over an executive council meeting. And central office said, no, it doesn't. He totally ignored the constitution. And so it's going to be ignored. And central office said, if you try to pursue your action and start reselection, then we will put the association into suspense. We will remove all the officers and put our own people in. So that was the end position of central office. They were protecting Grieve all the time, and it was only when he lost the whip did they then allow us to start a selection process. But having started that selection process, they decided that we could only have three candidates. And the three candidates were one who we'd rejected in 1997, and one who was the chairman of the association, who was hoping to get it because he was part of the establishment, and Joy Morrissey. And I managed to, with my group of people, to ensure that Joy Morrissey was successful. So anybody thinking that they could just deselect their MP has got another thought coming, because central office will move in and protect them unless they've lost the whip.
Why is that then, do you think, that they protected someone like Grieve, who was going very much against party line at that point, or at least hypothetically the party line, and that nothing was done, as you said, until they removed the whip from him? Why is it that they protect people like that who no doubt have their, good sides or whatever, but at the same time they're going explicitly against party policy in a noisy way? I don't know, surely that should get them in trouble.
Because it's all part of the establishment, and the last thing that the MPs want to do is to show that they are accountable to the members. And it all started with, in 2005, at the time of the general election, when Howard Flagg made an extremely good conservative speech on the economy, and he had the whip taken away from him by Michael Howard. And his association, Howard Flagg's association, wished him to continue in the 2005 general election as their candidate. And Liam Fox went down and saw them and said, if you persist in this course of action and don't choose a new candidate, we're going to put you into suspense, remove your officers, and we will impose our own officers to ensure that the wishes of central officers are met. So they backed off and dropped Howard Flagg. And he was going to take legal action, but didn't take legal action. But 5 years later, of course, he was made a peer.
Interesting how that works. And do you think that, speaking on that, there's a little bit of a sort of element within the party that drops anyone who's considered too right wing, so to speak, or someone who they just who's deemed too much of a troublemaker because they challenge the establishment, like not only just Fly, but also in 2007, I think it was. I can't remember the MP's name. He was the Newark MP at the time. He was fired because he was allegedly said some insensitive things, even about being in the army, about some people who use racism as a cover. But other people, including black soldiers in his own infantry unit and his own association, backed him. But Cameron dropped him anyway, as in David Cameron. Do you think that there is that sort of element to sort of nudge people out of the way if, I don't know, the left don't like them, so to speak?
There is an element of that, undoubtedly, as the wokey left in the Conservative Party gain power, then they tend to go out of their way to denigrate any genuine, real Conservatives. That is why there is such a gap between the Parliamentary Party and the Voluntary Party.
And why do you think there is such a, why these people are so, I don't want to be too rude about this, arrogant in their beliefs that what they are doing is right and want to sort of weed out, gatekeep anyone they consider too right, when given that over the last 20 years at least, everything they seem to have done in terms of policy has not ended up to, it seems to have ended up in failure, and they don't do very well electorally most of the time. Why do you think they still are so strident in their views? Is it just because they have the power, so shut up, pretty much?
Because they are of a state of mind where they do not believe in principle, They do not believe in a conservative values. They do not believe in a conservative philosophy, and many of them have their route to power has been via university, studying PPE, becoming a special advisor or an advisor, a political advisor, working as an intern in an MP's office, and then perhaps joining a think tank and then becoming a member of parliament. And this has changed enormously from the old situation. After the Second World War, very large numbers of conservatives were former servicemen, and they knew about leadership and organisation. The other part of the party were retired businessmen who had made their fortune, got to the age of about 55, and wanted to do something publicly. So both sets of people were fairly independent minded and often had great intellectual depth and produced some superb ministers over the years. Whereas today, there are fewer people who've got a service record because the services have got cut down to 70,000 in the army. There are a few people who've actually made their money in business, except for the quick, rich, quick characters who are the hedge fund managers who are about 50% of the party's donors. But the MPs, many of them have got no business experience, no experience in organisation at all. And so, and because they have no philosophy, they just go the route that they think suits themselves.
Mm-hmm. And do you think maybe one thing on that, why is it that actually, yeah, the question I wanted to ask is that how is how is it that back in the 1980s, for instance, we're because we're talking about ministers, you had a lot of heavyweights in the cabinet, whether it be the more right wing of the party, more conservative wing, I should say, sorry, of people like Norman Tebbit, Ian Gow, whatnot, and on even people like Ken Clarke and Michael Heseltine were still sort of very well known big names. How do we go from that in the 80s to now the biggest names in the cabinet are Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak and all these sort of characters who, as Peregrine Wistthorne would have said, are people who are somebody's because they've been elected.
Yes, and many of these characters that you referred to currently, their kind of business record pretty abysmal. And I think it's because, once again, in the 80s, if you went to a party conference, somebody like Michael Heseltine would speak for half an hour on his subject defence, for example. And so he had to go into some depth and detail of policy in his speech. Today, what happens is that Minister of Defence goes to the party conference, he's given 10 minutes and he waffles around and comes out with no policy at all. And the whole training of once again, a party conference, we used to get the parliamentary candidates go up and make their speeches, and often that was the way in which their names became known. And particularly in some of these marginal seats or seats up in the north, they would make a speech, get it into the local paper, and then get onto the council, the local council, and push things along there. But then suddenly, central office decide that, in these kind of northern seats, they wouldn't get any assistance at all because they didn't have enough agents. In the mid-60s, we had 550 constituency agents. Today, we've got about 30. So we just do not have the training facilities for constituency officers and for constituency agents that we used to have. It's become a very sloppy organisation, centrally controlled.
Mm-hmm. And one question I wanted to ask you is that, talking about 2024, funnily enough, is that if the Tories lose, which they're most likely going to do, it seems at this moment, but then again, anything could happen, I suppose. Fraser Nelson offers an optimistic view. The Telegraph, that's his view. I'm not sure I share it, or you do either. Anyway, but do you think that if they do lose, that it might give groups like yours a bigger opportunity to demand further change of the leadership of the party in the way it is structured. Because the last time they were at least willing, albeit they failed, to listen to your demands, albeit they didn't enact them very well, and didn't do what they wanted.
After we lost big time in 1997, they did listen to me, um, and that's why we went along the road towards creating a constitution. Unfortunately, it all got strangled at birth. So if we lose big in 2024, I have no doubt at all that they will realise that the party's got to be totally reformed. But it may be if they don't start that process now, then by the time we get to 2024, it will be oblivion. And don't forget, in Canada, the Conservative Party in Canada went down to horrific defeat with 3 MPs. And what did they do immediately after this? They started publishing their accounts. They made the people running the party accountable to the party members, the chairman and the treasurer, and they brought democracy into the party. And they had to do that in order to build the Conservative Party in Canada up, and they were very successful in doing it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, when losing in 2024, do you think the threat comes more from Keir Starmer's Labour or a more, right-wing challenger? Because Nigel Farage has been making threats on Twitter, for instance, about doing this sort of thing. Reform UK are making lots of noise. Where do you think the threat will come from? Who do you think the biggest threat will come from electorally?
If Nigel Farage got together with some senior Tories, that would be a huge threat. But whether he's able to do that, I don't know. I'm afraid the Labour Party is just hopeless. What we've been doing, we've been implementing kind of Labour policies over the last few years. So what is the Labour going to do? I mean, they want to spend more money, but in fact, the bar to that now is the size of the government's debt and the cost of interest on it. So there isn't room anymore for the big tax and spend type of economy. So all I could think is it would be a total disaster if Labour got in. So it would give an opportunity to a revived Conservative Party to come back at the following election. But that revived Conservative Party will only come back if it starts this radical reform.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it will be left open then to somebody like Nigel Farage and others.
Mm-hmm. And do you think maybe one thing on there is that Raheem Kassam, actually, another Conservative commentator at a different Bow Group event, funnily enough, he noted that if the Conservative Party is put out in opposition, one thing that he sees there might be a parallel to the 70s, where he felt that the Labour government of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan at that time was not meant to last, and then led to Margaret Thatcher. Do you think there might be a similar thing happening where actually a lot of the members start to get discontented? A lot of the MPs decide to actually, show some guts for once. Do you think that there might be parallels there, or do you think the times are so different that actually that won't happen?
Well, I mean, we are losing members. I anticipate we're going to lose a big chunk of membership over the next month or so, or over the next 2 to 3 months. And the fewer members you've got, the less capability you've got of fighting a general election campaign, and that will be bringing huge problems. I think in the 70s, what happened was that after we lost in the 2 elections in 74, there was a move by the Conservatives, and quite a number of them, towards proportional representation, because the feeling was that the Conservatives would never hold office again. And that may well come about. Now, the Labour Party is flirting with proportional representation. The party as a whole and the trade unions all want it brought in, but Keir Starmer doesn't. But if Keir Starmer changed his mind and they brought in proportional representation, unless they brought it in as an STV type PR, but they brought it in as a list system PR, a list system PR would be absolutely disastrous for the country. But it could keep the Conservatives out of office for a generation.
And following enough, that actually leads on very well to my next question. Actually, is that you're in favour of expanding democracy more broadly in the UK, just beyond the Conservative Party, having backed the Yes side in the 2011 AV referendum and campaigning for elected House of Lords. What would be the specific benefits of having such changes in our governing style, and would that be applied logically to having an elected head of state as well?
Let me deal with those. So, elected head of state, no. The position, my position as far as the head of state is concerned, is that as long as the king commands the consent of the people, then he just carries on. If there was a, supposing there was a 70% or 75% view that the monarchy was finished, then I would call for a referendum on it, and not just on the king. If he lost the referendum, I would then say about William, let's have a one on William. But only if we lost two referendums, the monarchy lost two referendums, would I agree to change. And in fact, in the 60s, I had a letter in the Times saying precisely that, although at that time it was the Queen and Prince Charles. So that's as far as the monarchy. As far as the House of Lords is concerned, it should, first of all, it needs to be halved in size, much too big. And so it should have it reduced to about 450. And in my view, it should have PR, but on a regional basis, so it's evenly spread across the whole country. But it should have no more power than it has at the moment. So its powers will be severely restricted, but just as it has a second opinion, so that it can bring in expertise on legislation. As far as the alternative vote concerned in the House of Commons, what a tragedy that Cameron changed his mind on that, because he said he was going to be neutral in that campaign. And if we got the alternative vote, that would probably have given us an extra 20 seats in Parliament. And in fact, it would have kept out the Lib Dems, and it would have been very helpful if the Conservative Party linked up with Brexit Party and had fought together in their voting. But what happened was that I was on the National Council for the alternative vote, and it was dominated by the Lib Dems. They did a huge survey, 20,000 people the year before the referendum, and that survey of the people showed that something like 68% were in favour of the alternative vote. So the Lib Dems decided that as they were going to win this referendum, they would exclude the Brexit Party and exclude the Conservatives and Labour. And so their campaign was very narrow, and in the hope that they were going to win. But that was at the point when Cameron had said he was going to, the Conservative Party, were going to remain neutral on the issue and let the people decide. Then in January of 2011, there was a meeting held at the House of Commons, and I was speaking at it together with Matthew Sinclair, who was leading the No campaign, or director of the No campaign. And the meeting was absolutely packed out, in the standing room only. In fact, we had to stand on chairs so we could be seen. And at the start of the meeting, the chairman said to the audience, which primarily were all conservatives, are you in favour of the referendum of the alternative vote? And overwhelmingly, the audience said no, they weren't. So we had the debate, and at the end of the debate, the chairman then said, right now, has anybody changed their minds? Can I take the vote again? And to everybody's amazement, I suddenly got 40% of the votes there. Matthew Sinclair panicked and went straight to David Cameron and to the people who were financing the No campaign and said, look, we're going to lose this campaign unless Cameron comes out and opposes the alternative vote. The donors went and saw Cameron and said, oppose it or we're going to withdraw our donations. And Cameron gave in and the following day came out and said, that now the Conservative Party opposed the alternative vote. So that's what happened there. Tragedy, really, because it would have been the Conservatives would be in a much better position now if that alternative vote had gone through.
Sorry. And the next, one of the last questions, I'll discuss the final question in a second. One thing I wanted to say before I do that actually is that I do find it interesting because in Italy and Sweden, they have different, more proportional voting than we do. And they're elected governments to the right of we are at the moment, which I think should maybe say something, but I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yes, nearly all these places that you talk about with proportional representation are not based on constituencies and STV. And I could tell you a little story. I was at a meeting at the European Parliament with the director of the European Parliament just before the last European election, where we were still standing candidates. And I said to him, I said, look, Spain operates a PR system, and they only announce their candidates a month before the election, and it's all done on a list basis. And they decide, the parties decide what position in the list each candidate is. So it's not democratic at all. I said what it does is it leads to huge corruption, both for people to get on the list and then to be on what position on the list. And the director of the European Parliament said to me, I totally agree. He said, my problem is that in order to change the system in the European Parliament, I've got to get those very people that have got there corruptly to vote for change, and I can't do it. That sums up Europe and the European Parliament.
Yeah, it explains a lot, quite frankly.
It explains what I have to tell you, it was at that point that I became a very strong Brexiteer, because I've been I voted against Europe in the 74 referendum on the common market. I voted against joining the common market, but then I thought, well, now decisions been taken democratically, you've got to support it. So I gave a lot of support to Europe during the 80s and 90s. But after I had that meeting with the director of the Parliament, I thought, that's it. I'm out, and I became a strong Brexiteer.
So sort of reminds me of the story Norman Tebbit told me about sort of a similar issue when he became very anti-Europe after hearing sort of the anti-democratic way it worked. But the final question, the penultimate question rather, I wanted to ask you, because it's the title of the show and I ask all my guests, is what would your ideal world be?
I don't think there's an ideal world. I think that human nature doesn't lead towards that ideal world. I suppose my ideal world will be strong conservative values, strong family values, because I think that the basic unit of society is the family. And I think it's been tragically, been so many attacks on it, in recent years, that it's lost its sense of purpose. But happiness comes with contentment, and contentment you often get in families, but you can also get nowadays, I'm afraid to say, angry disputes within families too. So I suppose my ideal world will be a world of happiness.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And the final thing I wanted to say is thank you for coming on the show. And if people wanted to find more about you and your campaigns and stuff like that, where can they find you? Like, what sort of social media websites do you have?
I'm on Facebook under John Strafford. I'm on YouTube under John Strafford. I'm on LinkedIn as well, and Instagram.
Okay.
So they can look at all my conference speeches are on YouTube. Okay. But you have to look at the playlists and look up Tory conferences and look at some of the films that I've made about Tory party organisation too. And also, my father was killed in the war, so I never knew him. And I've done a film about the Italian campaign during the Second World War.
Yeah, so thank you for coming on again, and have a good evening.
Great. Thanks ever so much. It's been a pleasure.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. If you like that and want to see more, please like and subscribe. as well as share. For longer episodes of the show with exclusive content, check out the audio versions of these podcasts, which are linked in the description below. If you would like to recommend guests, as well as get some other exclusive perks related to the show, please consider subscribing to both my Patreon and or subscribe to Scarlet accounts, as linked in the description below as well. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.